This is really important. We're going to start with Luhmann and Derrida, an amazing chapter, especially with regards to Luhmann and Habermas debates that we will be getting into further on in this channel. Chapter 1. Luhmann and Derrida. Of all the constellations in which Derrida's work could be placed, the one involving Luhmann's ouvre is the most outlandish, but also the most revealing. Each of the two thinkers has been honored with the highest and most problematic praise that can be bestowed upon an author in the field of theory, that he was the Hegel of the 20th century. Titles of this kind may be attractive for superficial reflection and useful for public relations, but they can hardly accompany any serious interest. Nonetheless, they possess a certain characterizing power in the case of both these eminent figures, insofar as Hegel is not simply a proper name, but also refers to a program or a position in an educational process. To mention Hegel is to speak of culmination, the non plus ultra, and exhaustion. At the same time, the name stands for synthetic and encyclopedic energies that can only appear in the calm after the storm, or as Kojève and Quinu might have put it, on the Sunday after history. These names mark a confluence of imperial and archival ambitions. It would obviously be completely pointless to examine Derrida and Luhmann in terms of their respective unique Hegelianism. Nor were the two men Sunday thinkers, but rather the opposite, tireless workers who made Sunday a working day, literally and for fundamental reasons, and furthermore held the conviction that on holidays one either takes care of private correspondence or remains silent. And we can just for a moment think about the Protestant ethic at work here compared to the Confucian ethic, where there is no holy day, and work and life and neoliberalism and the individual as the firm are all ubiquitous. What can be said is that both thinkers were concerned with completion, and while conveying the appearance of innovation, were perfectly and retouching the finished image of a tradition that could not be extended any further. There is certain irony that, in fact, as we can see today, all those who thought that deconstruction and systems theory, constructs that emerge with a distinct profile from the 1970s on, had ushered in a new age of thought that opened up unlimited horizons for theoretical work, were mistaken. Yes, both thinkers are products of a post-apocalyptic kind of thinking, where there is no future and we have to start with the worst case scenario. That's what's actually really good about both of them. In reality, both conceptual approaches were the unfinished result of logical processes that had shaped the thought of the 19th and 20th centuries. In the case of Derrida, this involved the conclusion of the linguistic and semiological turn, according to which the 20th century had belonged to the philosophies of language and writing. In the case of Luhmann, on the other hand, it was the completion of the abandonment of philosophy called for by Wittgenstein. Man, I could never pronounce this guy's name. Wittgenstein. Achieved through a resolute withdrawal of thought from the tradition of philosophies of the spirit and language in order to reposition themselves in the field of meta-biology. So just a quick note on Luhmann. Luhmann is very close to Varela in terms of creating a philosophy that's about autopoietic systems on a larger scale, something that Varela actually warns about. But we can see that Luhmann needs this kind of system to get out of this individual genetic drive and more towards a systematic genetic drive, like something that through language we evolve as a meta species, not as individuals, but as some sort of biological whole, as in societies or something very similar to Hegelian Geist. And that's why both of these philosophers are seen as the Hegels of our century, according to some. The general logic of differences between system and environment. Metabiology. What both effects have in common with the case of Hegel is that they use final possibilities of given grammar to the full, and thus give their successors the initial euphoric feeling of starting at a high point. This subsequently gives way to the alarming realization that if one starts at the peak, the only way to continue is downwards. In all other respects, the differences between the two Hegels of the 20th century could hardly be greater. A certain superiority on Derrida's part is most evident in the fact that, like no other thinker except Heidegger, he always operated at the outmost edges of tradition, and thus kept tradition, however fractured, on his side. This explains the incredible effect of his work in the academic world, where deconstruction proved to be the last chance of a theory that achieves integration through disintegration. By breaking through the boundaries of the archive, it offered a possibility of holding it together. Luhmann, by contrast, left the philosophical archive behind, contenting himself with the ostensibly modest title of a sociologist of world society. To him, the only significance the philosophical library of the old Europe still had was as a reservoir of verbal figures with which the priests and intellectuals of former times attempted to grasp the whole. From the perspective of general systems theory, philosophy as a whole is an exhausted, totalizing language game whose instruments corresponded to the semantic horizon of historical societies, but can no longer do justice to the primary fact of modernity, namely the progressive differentiation of the social system. It is regrettable that the two Hegels of the 20th century did not respond extensively and reciprocally to each other. Thus, we have no comprehensive minutes of the virtual logical summit conference of postmodern thought. It would have been immeasurably exciting for the intellectual community to experience the two eminent intelligence of our epoch interacting in a situation of elaborated dialogue, as both Derrida and Luhmann were both of an extremely polite nature. Each would naturally have resisted the temptation to treat the other's work reductively, let alone cannibalistically, as is normally the case among rivals for the highest position of the field of intellectual opposition. Now, this is really important. I think that philosophers bring something to the table that no other discipline does, especially when you look at how different disciplines within psychology look at each other very reductively and look at each other very cannibalistically. I think that cannibalism here refers to how, for example, how Islamic philosophers or Islamic people, they look at the far-flung religions and they say, oh, this is also a part of Islam, when it's a completely different metaphysical world. Or intersectional people do this as well. They go to the most far-off temples and they try to look for and they try to apply their universality onto, and even if the universality is one that is supposedly there to respect particularity, just like both Islam and intersectionality claim, right? They cannibalize it. They bring in to their own fold. It's these cancerous ideologies, especially with the ideology of neoliberalism. I think does it the best out of all these. Nonetheless, each would have had to attempt assimilating, though not absorptive, translations of the other into his own terms, which, with two such masters of skepticism towards the very concepts of their own, would have proved a stimulating exercise, and the observers of these translations would have had the privilege of being able to observe the reciprocal observations of the most conceptually powerful observers. Luhmann certainly paid close attention to Derrida's work, though nothing is known about Derrida's returning the observation. It would seem that he never explicitly acknowledged the work of the scholar from B-field. Luhmann saw Derrida's deconstruction of the metaphysical tradition as an undertaking closely related to his own intentions, in the sense that he saw the same post-ontological energies at work that drove his own system theory project. He openly admitted that deconstruction was and would remain a relevant option, that it indeed did precisely what we can do now. This means that deconstruction is a strictly dated form of theoretical behavior, dated in the sense that it could only appear on the scene after the conclusion of conventional theory's historic formation, and thus consistently remains connected to a situation to which Luhmann assigns 5 attributes: post-metaphysical, post-ontological, post-conventional, postmodern, and post-catastrophic. Exactly, that's what I mean by post-apocalyptic. Deconstruction, according to Luhmann, presupposes the catastrophe of modernity, which should be thought of as a shift from the form of stability existing in traditional hierarchical centralist societies to a form of stability found in the modern differentiated multifocal society. Once multifocality is taken as a point of departure, all theory moves to the level of the second-order observation. One no longer attempts a direct description of the world, but rather re-describes and thus deconstructs existing descriptions of the world. One could say that Luhmann honored Derrida by crediting him with the achievement of finding a solution to the fundamental logical task of the postmodern situation. Switching from stability through centering and solid foundations to stability through greater flexibility and decentering. With the sure feeling of the latent pathos of deconstruction, Luhmann adds the following to his concluding acknowledgement. Thus understood, deconstruction will survive its own deconstruction as the most relevant description of modern society's self-description. The decisive element here is the seemingly harmless verb survive. In using it, Luhmann may have touched on the motivational core of the other Hegel's work. One could indeed think that Derrida devoted his ambition to the development of a form of theory that could always have a future and the potential to become a tradition. This would have been achieved by permitting and even demanding an application to itself, in the certainty that it would always emerge from such a test in a regenerated and reconsolidated state. The trick could only be pulled off by a theory that was always already lying in its own grave, so to speak, rising from it only for repeated burials. Could it be that the core impulse of deconstruction was to pursue a project of construction with the aim of creating an undeconstructible survival machine? I think some quick thoughts before we move to the next chapter on Freud would be beneficial. I think that the way Sloterdijk positions Luhmann in his critique against Derrida can be critiqued because if you look at my Ritual Traces 7, the one where Spivak talks about subjectivity, the deconstruction as a method doesn't presuppose a deconstruction, meaning it uses the Heideggerian methodology of bracketing so that you bracket whatever the concept is, not presupposing its deconstruction, nor presupposing that it's wrong. You just leave it as it is, as kind of a cultural product, and then you do the deconstruction process to find out what can be taken out from it that you can utilize, or maybe utilize is not the best word here, you can see as maybe emancipatory, so it doesn't actually destroy what it was already there, nor does it already pretake that it was never there in the first place. It leaves the cultural product in itself there hanging almost, and then moves on to see if any more emancipatory potential can come out of that cultural product. And so you can see this with the concept of subjectivity that I talk about, or actually I don't talk about it, Spivak talks about it. And ironically, this question of subjectivity is the best tangent towards talking about the next chapter, which is Freud.